theme for our finale creative brief was evolution, and I took the scientific route with this. I was trying to demonstrate the scientific process of osmosis, so that literally means the passing through of molecules into the membrane. On a more conceptual level, it can also mean absorbing in everything that you've learned. What I started doing first was I mixed part A and part B silicone. So I used the silicone to make a 3D effect rather than painting on the illusion, because I really wanted my final look to have as much realism as possible. I thought it would have a lot more impact than just drawing on highlights and contrasts. The second step I went in was blocking out the brows on my model. I initially go in first with the Pritt stick. I layer over maybe twice, and then I go back in with a pintail comb, and it's a technique that I use to really flatten and separate the brow hairs and push them against the skin of my model, and it just helps really make sure that all those brows are laid down as flat as possible to the model's face, leaving like a clear canvas to then paint over. So after I apply the Pritt stick to the model's brows, I use a cotton bud with a droplet of water, and then rolling away from the model's brows, I'm just getting rid of any excess Pritt that I didn't really want sticking to the rest of my model's forehead. Afterwards, I set the glue with translucent powder. This helps dries up any extra tackiness in the glue, and it just makes sure that all the brows that are glued underneath are just held in place so that they won't move when I start applying paint on top. I started with yellow colour because this was the colour that I'd chosen for the centre of the cells inside my creation. A lot of the other colours that I used for the rest of my makeup look were quite cool toned and contrasting, so I knew when the end of the look was going to be completed that these cells were going to really pop out with a brighter colour, like these kind of sporadic bursts of yellow. So after I lay down the yellow grease paint, I then mixed some Fuller's Earth with a red aqua paint together in a bowl, and I use a flat end brush to apply the Fuller's clay on top of the yellow grease paint. So in about half an hour to an hour's time from now, the Fuller's Earth should dry, and I should have the red clay crack, and then it would show the yellow grease paint underneath, and that was going to give me a really cool like cell membrane effect. The reason why I chose Fuller's clay to create the cracking effect, I wanted this to look as realistic as possible. I didn't feel that I could achieve the same realism by painting on the cracking image. I wanted to also just use alternative makeup mediums to kind of showcase different skills. So once I'd applied the part A and part B silicone and I set down the cell colors, I then went in to create what was going to be the basis of the overall color for my look on my model. I started applying with a flat end brush black grease paint, and I was going to be creating a gradient from black, blue into white, starting from my model's chest, going up through the neck, and then eventually ending at the forehead. I used a flat end brush to apply the grease paint because, like painting, I just found it easier to get into the tighter lines where my model's skin was meeting the edges of where I'd applied the silicone to create the veins. And then when there was more broader areas where I just needed to get grease paint applied as quickly and as far as possible across my model's skin, it was easy then just to turn onto the flat side. It was just the grease paint would slide onto the skin a lot easier. So I go on to my next color, which is kind of like a dark purple undertoned blue. I'm using a flat end brush again, but I'm using a smaller flat end brush so that I can get into smaller areas. So the color scheme that I was using for this gradient, black, blue into a lighter color, it was also to represent my evolution through using color as a contestant on the show. I felt like I was suffering from imposter syndrome in the competition at the start, not knowing where my place was or my worth. And that gradient from black, purple into blue. Blue is a color of calm, a little bit more control, and I found once I got my rhythm halfway through the competition, I was feeling a lot more calm in the challenges. So I wanted this color technique to represent my emotions from the beginning to the end of the competition. At this point, I can start to see the fuller's clay is drying and cracking with the air, and now some of the yellow from the grease paint below the red clay is starting to come through, and that was exactly what I was trying to achieve. I used a blending sponge to make sure that I had blended the color. So once I had set using eyeshadows my gradient base color, the black, purple, blue and white, and the fuller's clay was doing its magic, I then used red aqua paint to paint over the silicone veins. I started to break down an aqua paint with water, making sure that the aqua paint was very loose and consistent, and then I went back in with my little toothbrush and I created kind of a yellow speckle effect into the very center of what was going to be the cells. If you were to use a regular makeup brush, the brush hairs are too soft and you wouldn't have as much concentrated control over where the speckles were going to land. The next thing that I started to do was I actually used a dried up seaweed sponge, and just like with the toothbrush, I put the sponge into aqua paint, and basically the texture of the seaweed sponge, when you dab that lightly into paint and you press it onto my model's canvas gently, it creates a really cool kind of like fluid pattern. It's always easier to use aqua paint on top of a grease paint once it's set because the two mediums won't mix with each other. So now I'm going in with a really bright fuchsia pink aqua paint and using a long thin paintbrush to draw these kind of delicate swirly lines, and these are going to be kind of like the highlights on top of the silicone veins that I created. I was kind of freestyling at this point. I'm definitely a creature of colour, and if there was anything that I wanted to get from this final look, is that I made sure my colours really stood out and that they were really vibrant, really pigmented. There's a very thin line between making something look kind of, give it a lot of movement, but then literally just covering what you just spent 2 hours creating in loads of pink swirly lines. So I was really vigilant about making sure that every line placement had a reason, or that it still had like good movement to the whole look. I wanted to add another layer of texture material, and I decided to apply a little bit of purple thread. It's kind of a funny little add-on that I just threw on at the last minute. I was definitely happy with the finished look. I felt that it really kind of showcased just my free range of just creativity. I felt like I was really stepping out of my box and not controlling too much the artistry. I really felt like I gave, the final challenge my best efforts.